It's been no secret that Final Fantasy XI was one of my favorite games of all time, but it's not widely known that in 2004 I briefly had quit the game, frustrated with my favorite job summoner struggling through a bit of a rough patch. I'd pretty much gone through with it for a full month until a friend essentially trapped me in his car and played through some of the more memorable songs from the soundtrack. I'd resubbed that very night and was back in Vanadil. So powerful was the effect that this game's music had on me. We've gone through some of my favorite zone tracks in my previous video, which I'll link below in the description, but some of the most incredible tracks are more rarely heard. So in this video I'm going through my top 5 quest and mission songs, which were often a reward in their own right. So hey guys, it's Hunt4Games, bringing you as always a healthy mix of videos on new releases and MMOs, and nostalgia trips for the classics that made us fall in love with games in the first place. And in my opinion, nothing can match the nostalgic effect of a soundtrack when it comes to gaming. Scientists will tell you that smell is more powerful, but until I can smell Sarudabur and soil for myself, we'll never really know. Soundtracks have it easy as far as nostalgia goes, because you hear them constantly, reinforcing either your love or hatred of the song and the zone over time. But cutscene music was heard much more rarely, sometimes only once or twice in an entire game, and that often makes it extremely special. So let's get into the top 5 tracks I personally could never forget, although in my difficult attempt to narrow it down, I struggled to find any that didn't produce some pretty intense emotions in me. So forgive me if your favorites aren't on this list. Also, I'd like to take this moment to make a correction to my previous video, where I stated that Nobuo Uematsu was the sole composer for Final Fantasy XI, as I'd previously believed. I was informed by Ben Riley83, Tenchi Hawking, Havish, and many others that Naoshi Mizuta actually composed many of the zone tracks that I fell in love with, and that Kumi Tanioka composed many others as well. Appreciate the correction guys, but on to the tracks. Final Fantasy XI isn't a game with a continuously happy-go-lucky storyline. The opening cutscene tells the tale of a devastating fall of Tavnazia from the perspective of 2 young children, one who tragically stays behind to let her brother escape. Hits you right in the feels from the get-go. So what better way to kick off this list than with this track, Sorrow. This track, like many others in the game, it can be hard for me to pinpoint exactly what I remember when I hear it, but from my recollections it was mostly used when they were reflecting on past events from Final Fantasy XI in the storyline that maybe didn't go quite as well as we'd hoped. Sorrow is a hauntingly beautiful track that comes up very often in cutscenes and general storyline quests in Final Fantasy XI. It wasn't always tragedy or devastation, sometimes it was just a parting of friends or even an opportunity missed. But it never failed to draw me into the new tale that I was trying to understand the background of. It's hauntingly beautiful and the perfect example of why Final Fantasy XI, more so than other MMOs, kept me so invested in the world. Over time, as is common with many game tracks, the song itself almost delivered upon expectation for me. I sort of began to associate it with certain emotions and a certain format of storytelling, so whenever I heard it, I knew what to expect from the game. This just kept me invested, drawn in, and focused on whatever tale they were trying to spin. Of course, even after the sadness, almost regret of the previous track, nothing reminds me of Final Fantasy XI more than this song, Recollection. Recollection never ceased to pull together all of the events, all of the moments, the fights, the battles, the victories, defeats that had led up to whatever moment I was witnessing. It just summed up my feeling of accomplishment, but not in such a way that it was just pure happiness. I can't think of a single storyline in Final Fantasy XI that didn't have some layer of defeat within it. It was never just I went straight to the boss and I won. There were losses, there were constant struggles, characters that didn't make it. I don't think a game's soundtrack has ever perfectly encapsulated all those feelings for me at once as much as Recollection does. And it set the bar pretty high for other games. It was also the first time I heard this little lilting tune that do so softly in the background that would come to later in life define Final Fantasy XI for me completely. Of course, while Sorrow kind of leads you into a new quest line, and Recollection seems to be that midway point where we understand our failings and our successes, Despair is that moment right when we realize we're totally boned. Shit has gone to hell, it is way more difficult than we ever could have imagined, somebody's gained the upper hand. I don't know, Vana'diel was just completely destroyed, who knows, but when you heard this track, you knew that shit just got real. And after multiple quest lines of frankly probably trying to figure out what's going on, speaking with different characters, traveling across Vana'diel, when you heard this, you realized that you were about to get into the good stuff. You now understood the threat and you were ready to face it. If that sounds vague, it's because it's hard for me to pin down exactly what this soundtrack means to me. I'm almost frightened and excited at the same time. It's like we've come up against something that we have no possible chance of defeating, but for the first time we understand what we're facing in its entirety, and that alone is sort of a victory. I've just always thought it really set you up perfectly for that thrilling boss battle, or even just setting you up for the next stage of quest lines, really getting you primed to kind of finish off this storyline. And while it's easy to constantly reflect on all the tracks that make me feel great and amazing, this one drove the game. And it can be crucial to remember that sometimes those are even more important. Of course, if the last track despairs, that moment when we realize we understand the threat and whether or not we can actually beat it, this track, Distant Worlds, might be one of the most memorable, even though I only think I've heard it in this rendition once in my entire playthrough. This song plays after we've completed my favorite expansion, Chains of Prometheus. To explain how important this moment was to me, it is kind of difficult. First of all, Chains of Prometheus was one of the hardest achievements I've ever actually obtained. Chains of Prometheus was an incredibly difficult journey with an incredibly amazing reward both in-game and just emotionally. The storyline was great, the areas were beautiful, the missions were difficult and challenging, almost excessively so at times, and then you got to choose the Rajas ring at the end. It was just incredible. Of course, along the way, you're introduced to many memorable characters. Prish, Olmia, Tenzin, that jackass. I may be going a little out of bounds here, but if you ask 9 out of 10 people their favorite expansion of Final Fantasy XI, Chains of Prometheus at least usually comes up. Sometimes the thing gets shot down for its difficulty, but it is incredibly memorable no matter how you look at it, and this song plays at its end. But for the first time, I heard a voice singing in Final Fantasy XI. I'd never heard such a thing. It blew me away. It also might have been 3 in the morning, so I was probably a little emotionally unstable at that moment after countless hours of difficult battles that had pushed me to the very limit. But I might have shed a tear or two. Come on, it was emotional. And as with most of my other favorite tracks in this game, it has that little do-do-do-do-do-do just kind of strewn in quietly in the back. Point is, even though I only ever heard this song one time, it seems impossible not to include it on this list. And I hope you all leave your favorite tracks in the comments below that I didn't include in this list, at least those focused on missions and quests. It was almost impossible for me to narrow this down to 5, so I'd love to revisit some of the others that I couldn't put on this one. Of course, if you've ever been to my channel before and know anything about me, you're probably not surprised to see this one on this list. You know that little tune I keep mentioning, that do-do-do-do-do-do? After being used to hearing it countless times in various forms in Final Fantasy XI, I was introduced to this, at least in my first memorable moment during the final Dragoon quest, where you got your artifact head. To this day, I get chills when they transition into the electric guitar. To this day, the only electric guitar I've ever heard in Final Fantasy XI. It both is completely out of place and wonderfully perfect. In the land of Vana'diel, something like an electric guitar makes no sense, but the intensity that it evokes, the emotions it makes me feel when they add it in, just totally changes how I feel about that little tune. I've for years then tried to learn how to play it perfectly myself, to varying degrees of success. I love this track so much I made it my subscription announcement music on Twitch. I I really just don't know what else I can say to it. Any single quest line in this game that contained this music was infinitely better in my mind. And when I finished Dragoon, one of my favorite jobs, both for his artifact armor and just general playstyle, and I got that last purple piece of gear, which, might I add, was also the coolest, the head. We're in the middle of that damn Temple of Ukalev. And I was exhausted after a long day of pulling people together for the quest line and making sure they all got here safely and then actually doing the fight, which was kind of difficult. And then I'm watching the cutscene and this music starts playing. I was blown away. And it may sound like I'm overreacting a little bit, but I just think it's the perfect collection of that quiet little, is it a flute? I'm not really sure. It's just so pretty. And then the transition to the electric guitar just makes it. Earlier I mentioned the nostalgic effect of Final Fantasy XI soundtracks. Well, none more so than this one. And even the name of it, One Last Time, perfectly represents my experience with Final Fantasy XI, where I always seem to return one last time. But guys, I hope you appreciate my picks for top 5 soundtracks in this game for quests and missions. If you haven't already, definitely check out my top 5, or 6, or maybe 7 soundtracks from the zone music in Final Fantasy XI as well. And let me know your favorites that you think I left out. Chances are I struggled over them pretty deeply, but I have missed a few occasionally, so I appreciate going back and listening to something I haven't thought about in a long time. Keep on the lookout for top 5 songs from event music, and then just random picks that don't really fit anywhere else. Because I love these videos, and I love revisiting the amazing music that this game contained. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace. As always, guys, thanks for watching. If you haven't already, you should totally think about subscribing. I've got videos coming out twice a week, and if you like this one, there's at least a chance you'll like some of the others that are very similar to this, so live dangerously. Let me know what you guys thought about the video in the comments, and other videos you'd like to see. And finally, follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Huntin for Games to keep up with all the latest stuff. See ya.